So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Margaret Anderson from the Old Treasury Building, and thank you so much for joining us today to hear what I know is going to be a fascinating lecture from Professor Melissa Bellanta. This is a special event presented as part of the Melbourne Fashion Week program. The lecture will last for approximately 30 to 35 minutes, after which Melissa will either take questions or she'd very much like to hear if you have any recollections to share. So let me begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the unceded land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We thank them for their care of culture and of country and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. It's now my very great pleasure to introduce Melissa Bellanta. Melissa is Associate Professor of Modern History at the Australian Catholic University. She is a social, cultural, and gender historian with a special interest in fashion, material culture, and the history of masculinities. She holds a current Australian Research Council grant investigating the social history of menswear in 20th century Australia. And her lecture today is entitled, as you saw, Men's Fashion in Melbourne's Swinging 60s, The View from a Discotheque. Welcome, Melissa.
Thanks so much, Margaret. This is the title of my talk. And before I begin, what I'm really wanting to do is just give a special shout out for Jim Colbert. Now, he was a freelance photographer who took photos for the youth magazine Go Set that opened in Melbourne. And he worked as a freelancer for the magazine between 66 and 68. And he's given me permission to draw on this an archive of incredible photographs that he took from this period. And he even worked hard making good scans of a swag of them that I'm going to show to you today. So if you're here, Jim, I salute you. And for everyone else, I think that you're going to agree that his collection of photographs is a treasure trove. I'm only just showing you a small, very small smattering of them actually in this talk. But that really capture an exciting moment in Melbourne's music, fashion, and youth cultural history. So let's begin. In her History of Australian Popular Culture, Friday on Our Minds, Michelle Arrow asked, did the 60s for Australians swing? Now, she meant, did Australians experience the 60s as a decade of druggy risk-taking, of sexual rebellion, of countercultural experimentation or radical politics, or of participation in way-out fashion and music in accordance with the tropes that are so often associated with the period? The most famous examples of the swinging 60s in the popular imagination all come from overseas, after all, whether Andy Warhol's art and scene setting factory in New York, or San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury neighborhood, the headquarters of flower power and a burgeoning gay scene in the late 60s and into the 70s. The images also obviously include Beatles in Britain, a British it girl, Jean Shrimpton, you can see here with actor Terence Stamp, and of course unisex fashion on London's Carnaby Street. Arrow's answer was, well, for the overwhelming majority of Australians, the 60s did not swing, no. In their case, the decade was a continuation of the emphasis on marriage and domesticity that had been so prevalent in the 1950s. But the 60s did swing, Arrow decided, for a small slice of city-siders aged between their teens and late 20s. And it's really these people that I'm highlighting today, or the people I'm highlighting anyway, belong to that demographic. I'm focusing on Melbourne men who either qualified as members of what this 1966 advertisement described as trendsetters, swingers, in people, people of fashion and the arts, or otherwise young men who at least aspired to belong to these groups, to join the swing set, as it were. Part of the reason I'm focusing on men is because so much of what's said or evoked when it comes to fashion in general, but also during the 60s, is about the clothing and style of young women. The groundbreaking international designers such as André Courrèges, Pierre Cardin, Ted Lapidus, Paco Rabanne, Rudy Gernreich, Mary Quant, and others, all designed either exclusively or predominantly for young women. And when one thinks of the 60s fashion in Australia too, many of the images that come to mind are similarly feminine. They might include go-go girls at Melbourne gigs, such as the ones that Jim's captured here, for example, or perhaps mini dresses. You can see this white and silver lurex striped shift dress that the jazz singer Judy Jacques is wearing above there. Or, you might think perhaps of the sort of pixie cut and mad prints and kind of catsuit that the R&B band, R&B singer Inez Amaya, who fronted the Levi Smith Clefs, is wearing on the left there. So as someone, though, that's currently working on a social history of men's dress in 20th century Australia, I'm interested in doing something about the far slighter attention that's given to menswear in Australia's dress and fashion and social history. I'm convinced that even though there tends to be a kind of reflexive dismissal of the idea that Australian men are interested in fashion, and even though pressure has long been brought on Australian men to dress inconspicuously rather than flamboyantly, or casually rather than impeccably, it's still the case that once you start probing, you always uncover so much more that's interesting about the role of clothing in Australian men's lives than you would initially. So I'm just giving you like a tiny little taste of various sites in which I've been investigating that in the course of a broader project. And looking back, men's clothing also always reveals a lot more about the period in which it was worn, offers us signs of the times than perhaps would have been apparent to the people who were wearing it at the time. The most obvious and stark aspect of the 60s or 70s that's revealed through men's dress was the generation gap. Two images taken in Toorak Road, South Yarra by the photographer Rennie Ellis capture this perfectly. The first is of a group of older men at the pub. You can see all in hats and collared shirts, most with suits, one with a buttoned up cardigan and tie. And the second image is of very nearby, of younger men at the hairdressers with their carefully coiffed longer or bouffant hairdos, the one in the front in tight slacks with his opened collared shirt and chain, and the hairdresser at the back in a loose white zippered jacket and flared jeans. Another aspect of Melbourne society that's revealed through menswear in this period relates to class, or perhaps more to the point, musical tastes that were loosely informed by class. The music journalist Craig Horne has talked about the broad division of young Melbourne men in the early 60s into those who were attracted to jazz and or folk music on the one hand, and those who were drawn to rock and roll on the other. The jazzers and renegades of folk were more likely to be middle class and go in for turtleneck sweaters, corduroy trousers, car or duffel coats, suede corduroy or scruffy flannel jackets, and desert boots or R.M. Williams boots with Cuban heels. The rockers were more likely to be working or lower middle class, Horne says. While rock and roll band members often wore matching tailored suits, on stage, many of the fans opted for black leather jackets, squeezy pompadour style hair, stovepipe trousers, short sleeve collared, often Hawaiian style shirts, if not also blue suede shoes. By 1966, however, the emergence of what was known as Sharpies in Melbourne introduced a new element into some young men of the city's sartorial repertoire. Sharpies were, as the name suggests, sharply dressed teens and early 20-somethings, hailing mostly from the working or lower middle class. Their style went through a series of evolutions over the years, so that the range of Sharpie looks in about 1973 or 1974 are actually quite different from those back in 66 when it first emerged. As you can see in one of these images that Jim took outside the captured Discotheque in Flinders Lane. Sharpie style of the kind of 66, 67 era expressed itself in flags, baggy trousers, or imported in American jeans, which were quite exotic still at the time, worn with striped knits, often maroon, bottle green or cream, neat short hair, and heeled chisel toe shoes. You can see an example of some of those there. Some Sharpies, alternatively, wore sandals with socks or collared crest knit shirts in the latest Bry nylon fabrics. And Jim again has captured an example of that here. The arrival of the mod phenomenon in the mid-60s also brought a range of new stylings that appealed mostly, but not exclusively, to the middle class. I'm going to discuss what this term mod meant in Melbourne shortly, partly because it meant a lot of things when it came to young Melbourne menswear. For the moment, though, I'll note that the term applied to clothes that were worn by a self-consciously hip, young, white, middle-class demographic. And it's the fashions and musical tastes of this demographic that I'll be focusing on for the rest of this talk. This historian Seamus O'Hanlon has marked out 1966 as really significant for popular and youth culture in Melbourne. 65s and particularly 66 is, if there was a swinging 60s in Melbourne, he says it's kind of this period that it starts happening. And he's right. It wasn't just that Melbourne's population reached 2.5 million by the late 60s, 40% of whom were under 21. Nor was it just that 1966 was the year in which former Monash University students began the new youth magazine Goat Set and quickly assembled an extraordinarily hip young staff that included Ian Molly Meldrum and the blues singer and columnist Wendy Saddington, and which also drew on the freelance services of photographer Jim Colbert. Clothing shops and fashion businesses influenced by Carnaby Street had begun opening in Melbourne in 1965, before 1966. There was Lord Henry's Gear in Russell Street, for example, a shop claiming to sell clothing embodying the new mod op way out look, including polka dot shirts and denim suits and all kinds of wild accessories for the switched on young man. There was also the House of Stripes, which was a fashion company and shop in Therry Street, owned by the designer Peter Langham, that sold more upmarket clothes for the so-called with it jet set. But it was in 1966 that Meyer Emporium opened its In Gear shop, offering eye-catching youth fashions to a backing of loud recorded music. As in Carnaby Street's clothing stores, the In Gear shop employed hip and attractive young staff to do the selling too, using new kind of selling techniques that appealed specifically to young people. One of these hip employees was Maurice Spinetti, a Tuscan-born Melburnian who'd recently, in the late 1960s, returned from a year in Italy, where he designed a collection of brightly coloured slimline continental look clothes for a company owned by his then boyfriend of the day. This is a photo of Maurice Spinetti's Genoese collection, and that's him standing in the back. You can see in the narrow dark clothes. Narrow dark clothes were sort of Lothario locks. Not long before he brought his chic and good looks to the In Gear shop upon his return to Melbourne in about 1967 or 68. Most significant for the rest of what I'll be talking to you about now was that 1966 was the year that a raft of discotheques opened in and around Melbourne. These venues were called discotheques because they were designed as places where young people could dance to music, although most of the music was performed by live bands rather than pre-recorded. Now, central Melbourne actually had a number of live music clubs in the first half of the 60s, the Bolinda Graves Street and 10th Avenue in Burke Street, for example. But the places that were billed as discotheques began opening from 65 and took off in the following year in 66. There was the Mad Hatter in Little Lonsdale Street, which opened in 65. For example, the former jazz lounge, the Fat Black Pussycat in South Yarra, South Yarra, which remodeled itself as a discotheque in 65. And in October 65, the Thumpin Tum opened its doors in Little Lonsdale Street and was soon pulling in large crowds. The Tum, as it became known, was the brainchild of Ron Eden and Ken Moat, two young, very hip gay creatives from the Meyer Emporium's window display interior design team. And they brought another Meyer employee, David Flint, on board to act as manager. He worked with his wife Jan at the door and became the venue's owner when Eden and Moat stepped away a couple of years later. Together in late 1965 and into Ron, Ken and David decorated the Tum with a sort of Edwardian revival meets pop aesthetic. So it had Tiffany lamps and Art Nouveau posters you can kind of see in the back of this image in its loungy upstairs spaces, and a vivid mural behind the stage and a dance floor whose ceiling was hung with upturned umbrellas downstairs. Bertie's was another discotheque owned by the wealthy Knight family. It opened up on the corner of Spring and Flinders Street with a dress to the nines dress code in 1966. Bertie was also kitted out in an Edwardian revival aesthetic, floral fabric screens, vintage lamps, gilt-framed mirrors and paintings and the like. Sebastian's, another venue, was also owned by the Knight family, and it opened in an abandoned millinery in Exhibition Street down the Carlton end in 1967. Sebastian's was again decorated in the evidently uber-fashionable neo-Edwardian style, chandeliers, brocade screens, and the like. You can see a little bit of that here in this picture. Besides Sebastian's, there was the Biting Eye in Little Bourke Street, and the Catcher, later called Traffic, that catered to a younger, more downmarket crowd in Flinders Lane. Like the countless church, community and town halls around Melbourne that converted to dance venues with music by live bands on weekends, the discotheques didn't have liquor licenses. You know, you came there to listen to music and to enjoy the vibe rather than to drink alcohol, unless you preloaded before you arrived. Unlike the town dances, however, most of the discotheques had hangout spaces, which were an important part of the experience. See here one of the members of Python, Lee Jackson, hanging out at Sebastian in the comfy lounge. It was partly because of the Thumpin Tum's upstairs lounge and cafe that Maurice Spinetti came to see it as a home away from home after he returned to Melbourne from Italy, for example. Spinetti hung out at the Tum with others from the city's burgeoning countercultural meets queer art, music and fashion crowd that often spent time at the Thumpin Tum. They included the original owners, Ken Mote and Ron Eden, or others such as Peter Tully, Linda Jackson, Wendy Saddington and fashion designer Clarence Chai. In his memoir, Sex, Thugs and Rock and Roll, however, the Australian rock legend Billy Thorpe noted that there were plenty of people for whom the amazing bands playing at Melbourne's best discotheques were, really where the action was, whether that was at the Tum or at hot venues such as Sebastian's or the Biting Eye. A further part of the attraction was that musicians socialised at these venues. So in another memoir, Michael Browning, who was the man who would later go on to manage AC/DC in the second half of the 70s, but managed Sebastian at the age of 20 in the late 60s, recalled that the Bee Gees would come and hang out at the club on their nights off in Melbourne. And he said that John and Merivale Hems from the uber-fashionable House of Merivale boutique in Sydney, here's one of their burgundy corduroy suits dating from the early 70s, they'd fly down and check out the scene at Sebastian's, he said, every second weekend. These various memories offer a clue as to why places such as the Tum and Bertie's could credibly market themselves as venues for Melbourne's swing set or people of fashion and the arts, with a good camp mix, the term that was used then instead of gay or queer, among their nightly crowds. Browning indeed described the Tum's clientele at the time this way: a mix of very cool and edgy art students, serious music lovers, pillheads and hipsters. So what did mod mean in Melbourne? I said earlier that I'd return to that question, and to think about what it meant when it was first heard in Melbourne in the mid-60s and the years following. The term's often used now as if it designated the members of a distinct youth subculture with a penchant for driving Italian scooters and a uniforms that centred on slimline tailored Italian or continental look suits. That wasn't the case in Melbourne. The idea that mod referred to a distinct subculture was circulated at the time from sensationalised reportage on televised news or in the tabloid newspapers that wrote about street fights between Sharpies and mods. But actually, most of the fighting, that if it was done in the street, was likely to be between different groups of Sharpie youth or between Sharpies and rockers, although there were cases of groups of sharpies waiting to attack people outside venues that were considered to be mod, discotheques like the Thumpin Tum or Sebastian's. In his memoir, Michael Browning says that from the middling 60s, he started hanging out at the Bowl, a live music club in central Melbourne, and hearing covers of British beat bands, such as the Beatles' Love Me Do, or what was then known as R&B, such as the Rolling Stones' Little Red Rooster. Browning had been a mid-teen rocker before that, but as soon as he heard this new music, he decided that he wanted to immerse himself in the emerging scene, and he quickly transformed himself into a mod, he wrote in his memoir. In his case, this meant exchanging his blue suede shoes for desert boots, putting on a mohair cardigan, he said, and getting a Beatles haircut. So as far as he saw it, mod at the time designated fans of British beat and R&B music who dressed up in up-to-the-minute fashions associated with these British bands. From late 65, really 66 through to 68, however, what was considered cutting edge and therefore mod started changing rapidly. The city's new discotheques had a lot to do with this. Once they appeared on the after dark scene, the concept of mod quickly broadened to encompass a number of, a range of musical and sartorial styles that were considered to be hip or swinging at the time. You have a sense of mod in this second sense as a loose synonym for with it, and with styles of music and dress that were coming out of Britain. When you consider the wording of this flyer advertising a first-year birthday celebration for the Thumpin Tum in October 1966. Dresses a la Carnaby, op, pop, anything goes or go, their flyer reads. And it's drawing attention, obviously, to the significance of London's Carnaby Street as the perceived headquarters of mod or happening fashion, but also explicitly to the idea that people should dress according to their own lights. So if I had to list some broad categories into which mod or swinging or hip styles of menswear in Melbourne fell between late 1965 and 68, I'd identify 4 key ones, largely actually from poring over Jim's photographs, but and from oral histories and other research in the period, or on the period. The first style I'm going to call, or have called, peppy casual. Now that's my own term, so that no one else will know what you're talking about if you were to use it. But by peppy casual, I mean some combination of the following: long sleeve t-shirts, either white or dark with bold horizontal white stripes, white checked or black slimline trousers or jeans, black sunglasses, white gym boots or crepe-soled lace-ups or desert boots, and in some cases, unisex chic. You can see examples of what I'm talking about from some images I'm about to show you, some of which have already appeared on previous slides. In the first place, there's these t-shirts that are worn with white and or black slacks by staff at the Scene, which was a weekend dance in Canterbury. You can see here the striped or all white collared jersey tops that are worn by the members of the R&B band Python Lee Jackson at Sebastian's. And here, the black sunglasses worn at night by Thumpin Tum founder Ken Moat, or the blues musician Jeff St. John. In Moat's case, he's got white gym shoes on and a long white t-shirt that actually you can tell from other photographs was printed with a sort of design, the Thumpin Tum logo and design. In these two images, you can see various examples of bold horizontal striping on sweaters or t-shirts, and a sort of black turtleneck sweater in one with a white knit, checked trousers or white jeans and denim jacket, all sort of comprising what I'm calling the peppy casual look, that in which white actually and geometric, particularly stripy kind of contrasts played an important role. In these images, you can see what I meant by the unisex chic. You can see the fashion historian Joe Paoletti has talked about the fact that unisex in this period really meant women wearing masculine styles rather than the other way around. And you really get a sense of that from these images. So in the far left, you can see a female keyboardist from a band known as the Cherry Ripes with a pixie cut and sort of white jeans and a white t-shirt printed with the Cherry Ripes kind of logo. It's the same outfit that other members of male members of her band are wearing. And you can see in the right, with an unidentified band, actually not known to me at any rate, with a female singer in a white short sleeve t-shirt and checked trousers similar to those that are worn by male members of the band. Now, I just wanted to draw attention here to the band Running, Jumping, Standing Still. They were all the rage at the Biting Eye and the Thumpin Tum and Berties in 1966-67. And some of their members, including the lead singer Peter Newing, who you can see here, are embodying a chic, which I'm drawing attention to because it was a kind of mix of peppy casual that I've just been talking about and a second style considered hip in the period. That is what I'm calling dark, slouchy or scruffy cool. It's extremely Melbourne. This style was especially beloved by soul meets blues R&B enthusiasts, and it was very similar to the kinds of clothes worn to jazz clubs. Lots of turtlenecks and black corduroy trousers with dark blazers or duffel coats or car coats and R.M. Williams boots or desert boots, scruffy Beatlesque do's or sideburns and modish facial hair. With his ribbed, close-fitting turtleneck and corduroy trousers, Peter Newing from Running, Jumping, Standing Still, you can see on the left of this slide, really embodied this cool. The male member of the unidentified couple that I showed you earlier, and you can see here in the middle of the slide, also has his own version of this kind of slouchy, dark slouchy, cool, dressed in all black with floppy hair and sideburns. And you can see this unidentified band that Jim has photographed on the right. These are all Jim Colbert's photographs as well. Have a slightly different version: slimline trousers, loose turtlenecks, pointy-toed heel boots in one case, and in another a jacket in a dark corduroy. If what I've called peppy casual and slouchy cool were two model hip styles in Melbourne from around the mid-60s, another that emerged around late 1965, 1966, was an over-the-top neo-Edwardian look, Rococo, sort of Edwardian revival is what I'm calling it here, that matched the decor of the discotheques such as the Thumb and Bertie's and Sebastian's. The elements of this style revolved around tailored three-piece suits, often with long-line jackets, also included colourful brocade fabrics, bishop sleeve shirts in some cases, worn with cravats or scarves or signet rings and cufflinks. You can see I've sort of dressed in a way that kind of nods to this Rococo Edwardian revival style today. David Flint, the manager of the Tum, embodied this mod style early on. You can see him here in a three-piece brown corduroy suit that he had made especially for him. And he's teamed it with a cravat and a spiffy white shirt with a stiff collar and cuffs. Tony Knight, the owner and manager of Bertie's, was even more extravagant. He was known to wear outfits such as rich maroon crushed velvet three-piece suits teamed with white lacy shirts, or the more sober but nonetheless mannered tailored number worn with a kind of cavalier-like moustache and a large rectangular pinky ring and side swept hair that you can see in this image here. The man on the left in this image, I showed you it earlier, has taken a leaf, it seems, out of Tony Knight's book in the extraordinary cutaway brocade coat with contrasting narrow black lapels and what looks like peroxided and brill-creamed hair that you can see him wearing. Other examples of performers getting into this kind of Rococo style may be found in the example of the pop singer Marty Christian at the Opus dance wearing a shiny brocade jacket and cravat. You can see in the middle of this slide. And the lead singer in this image over here, the lead singer of the Mixtures, wearing beads in a bright coloured silky jacket with belled sleeves and a kind of prominent ring. And here, Dan Robinson from the Wild Cherries, a kind of early psychedelic rock band, wearing tailored suiting and even bishop sleeves with exaggerated sideburns and this floppy fringe. The extravagant Edwardian revival stylings that I've been showing you now were an example of what some writers have called a peacock revolution in menswear that took place in and around Carnaby Street in London and some other urban sites around the globe in the late 60s. It's fair to say, though, that such showy peacock stylings didn't revolutionise Melbourne menswear. The neo-Edwardian fashion was short-lived even among the tiny numbers of Melbourne men who adopted it. The style was both too expensive for most budgets and too flamboyant and dressy for mainstream masculine Australian tastes. A style that did enjoy a somewhat greater coverage, though, was what I'm simply calling psychedelic. This was a sartorial mode that paved the way for what hippie existed in early 70s Australia, and was influenced by the growing popularity of LSD, and even more by the rising allure of fuzzy guitared psychedelic rock. The Beatles' 1967 release of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, sort of fitting into this shift. Psychedelic style took the form of medallions around the neck, beads and badges, or T-shirts with way out slogans. There was a crossover there with the radicalism of the Vietnam moratorium marches. Paisley shirts in purple and crimson, brocade or embroidered ribbons sewn onto the edges of jackets or onto jeans, and gillets, sleeveless vests, sometimes of suede or lambskin. This shirt from the Melbourne shirt label Glow Weave, I'm also wearing a Glow Weave shirt from the 70s here, offers you a sense of the kinds of prints and colours that were worn by some young men during the city's psychedelic era. The following images of band members I'm about to show you also offer examples of some of the sartorial elements I was just talking about. So, among other things, you can see Yuck Harrison from Max Merritt and the Meteors here wearing a kind of Western style hat and exaggerated modish moustache and sideburns. Very much a part of his look. A polka dotted shirt, various strings of beads and badges that read "Pray for Sex" and "Hippie Queen." Here you can see Dan Robinson again from the Wild Cherries rocking a paisley shirt and lambskin gillet, and members of the group showing off their sort of 60s medallions and a cardigan or jacket over here that has the kind of embroidered ribbon border that I was mentioning earlier. In this image, you can see Jerry Humphreys from the Loved Ones, an R&B band that had been formed by former trad jazz museums in 1965. He's wearing a silky kind of paisley high-necked tunic and floppy hat, and large ring. And in this fabulous shot of the Party Machine at the Thumpin Tum, which was a band formed by singer-songwriter Ross Wilson, lead guitarist Ross Hannaford, and former New Zealand R&B rocker Mike Rudd on bass. I love this image, with granny crochet chic and kaftani silky top and floral jacket with upturned kind of Nehru style collar, Mandarin style collar. But my favourite of all in Jim Colbert's photographs of this sartorial moment in Melbourne's history is this image of what I'd call camp psychedelic fashion that's captured among members of the crowd at the Catcher Discotheque. You can variously see here a military style jacket, a chinoiserie jacket, probably a woman's jacket, corduroy trousers with lace added to their pocket, and all manner of scarves and earrings and necklaces and bracelets and badges. Looking at this photograph, you have an inkling of why there was a homophobic subtext to the way that some Sharpies used the term mod back in 66 and 67, treating it as a synonym for slurs such as fag or poofter, and otherwise applying it to any fellow teen or early 20-something whom they considered to be effeminate and or pretentious. While this kind of camp psychedelic style, as I've called it, was both brave and unusual, however, it's possible to see how some of the other psychedelic stylings of the late 60s paved the way for the shift to the kaftani, tie-dye and jeans fashions of some hard rockers in early 70s Australia, a progression that's captured in a whole range of photographs. I've only got the opportunity to show you a couple here, but it's an amazing tranche of photographs that were taken by Harley Parker, a Thumpin Tum regular. You can see him here on the right in his wonderful kaftani sort of shirt. But I'm not going to be able to do anything more than just briefly gesture towards this, because my focus up until now has been on the late 60s, and there isn't really time or your energy concentration on your part, I'm sure, to do justice to the many shifts that took place in menswear in the 70s. The rise of jeans and denim wear being just one. These are some more photos from Harley Parker took at various Melbourne venues in 1971, and really you have a sense of quite how sharply men's fashion had changed just in this short period of time between the late 60s and the early 70s when you look at these photographs. So my aim in this talk has been to focus on those who are at the vanguard of young men's fashion in the era, the tiny slice of the population who experienced what you could call a swinging 60s, and who've been captured in Jim Colbert's treasury of photographs taken in and around discotheques. I've been at pains to show how significant Melbourne's discotheques were as sites of youth fashion, as well as of live music and its development in this period, and also to kind of gesture to how closely styles in men's fashion and musical tastes were linked in the period. If nothing else, I hope that the smorgasbord of images that predominantly date from the second half of the 60s in Melbourne discotheques has demonstrated that this was a really interesting time for young men's as well as young women's fashions. The music writers Shane Homan and Jen Rose have noted that the discotheques are often forgotten in the story of Melbourne's music industry, because venues such as the Tum and Bertie's only ran for a short time. Because they were non-licensed joints. Their patronage was swept away in the shift to pub rock in the early 70s, and with the arrival of a wave of hard rocking or country rock bands. But what I've been trying to indicate is that the rise of discotheques represents an ebullient, though brief moment in the city's fashion history, and that the wonderful photographs that Jim took in and around these venues allow us to appreciate something of this ebullience today. So thank you, Jim. And thanks also to the other people that I'm giving a shout out to, and to Old Treasury Building staff and Melbourne Fashion Week for having me. Thanks.
Thanks, Melissa. That was just terrific. And for those of us who are older than perhaps we want to confess, some of those images looked remarkably familiar. Now, we have a couple of comments here already, so perhaps rather than thinking about general questions, I might just refer to one of those. One is from Nicole Melissa, who says, in your favourite photo, a friend suggested that the man in front is Mick Hadley, singer from the Purple Hearts.
Oh, okay. Well, I love to investigate that. I didn't know that. So thank you. So you're talking about at the Catcher discotheque.
Your favourite, I remember that.
Okay,
yeah.
No, I put it down, thank you.
Yeah. And so somebody else who's actually anonymous says, thank you for your presentation, which is great. I was only a child in the 1960s, so I can't contribute additional information to your research, but I will attest that the family wedding scene you shared from that time resonates fully with my memories of family fashion at the time.
Yeah, we have albums full of those sorts of shots, so I totally agree with it.
Yes. And those wonderful sort of upside down pudding hats that really terrible things. I remember those. So yes, I remember some of those too. Melissa, what occurs to me, you mentioned that those who are at the discotheques were only ever a tiny proportion of most people, and a very youthful one assumes. Hence the fact that maybe part of the explanation for there being no alcohol in the discotheques, I suppose. So what age were the discotheques aiming at, really, in terms of their clientele and their fashion?
Late teens, early 20s. I mean, the Catcher discotheque had a younger crowd, so it skewed to sort of mid to late teens. But the Thumpin Tum, I remember I was talking with David Flint, it's sort of, he as a manager, he was well aware of this, from late teens through to kind of mid 20s, but, there would have been some people that were probably a bit older than that, but that's the kind of age group very much that it's pitched at, the kind of.
And presumably dependent.
they're kind of swinging. If there's such a, equivalent as a swing set now, it's that kind of age group that we're talking about, really, even in a contemporary sense, I think.
Yes, and presumably assuming that that's an age group that will have disposable money. Funds to invest in fashion. And so do you have any sense of how much people were spending to maintain an image at this time?
That's something that I don't actually know in terms of what that would be in real terms. I mean, I only know, that so much is written about the 60s, which is really borne out, I think, by these images where, it's the first time that young people do have en masse a disposable income, and that there's so many of them, that something like, I know this only from Seamus O'Hanlon's work, but something like 40% of the city's population is under the age of 21. So there's lots of, but then also that the post-war affluence that really comes into being in the late 50s into the 60s. So, but not in terms of, a more detailed breakdown, actually, Margaret.
Yes. We have another question. Was the clothing made locally or imported from the UK and or US? Could you discuss the preferred colour palette? And she says, very insightful and informative webinar.
Yeah, thank you. So it's a mix. So, Glow Weave, for example, that I mentioned, is a local Melbourne-based company that's making shirts that a Jewish Australian, so much of the story about that's in and around Flinders Lane is about Jewish Australians and other migrants. So there's definitely some local manufacture that's in the mix, but imported wear is also incredibly significant. So buyers for Myers In Gear shop, for example, have gone over to London and they've kind of selected and thought about fashion. There's, as I said, there are other businesses. So the House of Stripes by Peter Stripey Langing is a local business. Morris Spinetti worked in addition to, as in a period of time for In Gear shop, also worked for small fashion businesses that are catering to the youth market. But the imports are still they've always been an incredibly significant part of the mix for Australian fashion, and become more so. And the really big example of that is to do with jeans. The wave of the imported North American jeans sweep everything away. By 70s, in the early 70s, it's very much about imports.
Yeah, interesting. We have a comment from Carol, who says she was employed as Myers' first press officer in 1967. It's interesting, that was Myers' first press officer, isn't it? And loved promoting the In Gear shop and welcoming the bands in their coloured satin suits to put on lunchtime shows for Melbourne's trendy shoppers.
That's so fantastic, Carol. So there's an amazing Four Corners report, which is called Go Go Wear, which is available on YouTube. You can have a look. So, Carol, you might have even been there. I don't know. There's a moment in the launching of In Gear shop that has the band The Twilights, which was kind of very much a Beatlesque band playing with go-go dancers. That's fantastic that was a kind of an ongoing thing of live music, actually. I mean, that's also the amazing thing. It sort of blows my mind that there were live music clubs even at lunchtime. People describe going and listening to some really beat pop band or something in their lunch hour at the office, and then going back in the afternoon. I mentioned about the color palette. So, I mean, one thing that's so disappointing, isn't it, is about the black and white, because it's always startling when you see these images. And there's a whole range of colors going on, but red, pink, purple are very, significant colors, but there's a whole range of them. I mean, sort of thinking, I always imagine the kind of psychedelic moment as being purple, partly because we sort of talk about that kind of purple-edged, fuzzy guitared rock, and it's true that kind of style, that coloring was very fashionable, but it's not the only one. Bright, a whole range of bright coloring, basically, rather than a specific palette. But that's what I'd love to hear, if people have memories or of either their own or their parents' or grandparents' clothes from the era, kind of capture that more, don't they?
Yeah. And we have some lovely memories here. Nicole is saying that she did some research into the House of Merivale, and John Hems, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, estimated that some young people were spending 75% of their wage at the shop in the late 60s, early 70s. This sounds familiar. They lived at home, worked, and fashion was key to them. I guess nothing's new.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think Mr. John and Merivale opened in Melbourne in 1972. So it's slightly after the period of time that I was just talking about. But as I said, it's very much a hip kind of Sydney shop. But that was really interesting to me, Michael Browning saying that they were flying down to Sebastian's to see kind of what really happening style was like in order to kind of take back ideas for their business in Sydney.
Yeah. And there's a real sense of freedom in some of these reminiscences too. As Mary says, I went to the Thumpin Tum in 1966. I was 16.
Oh, fantastic.
And we would stay all night and catch the tram home in the morning. We also dressed unisex, and it was interesting to have that pointed out as a female. Yeah, 16. That's amazing.
Yeah, well, you definitely would have, according to what David Flint was saying, Mary, you've been on the young side of that crowd for the Thumpin Tum. But yeah, the fact that it also, they stayed open until for something, these clubs, even though they're not alcohol driven, they're open through to morning.
When did the trams start running in the morning? Do they still start running at 5, or is it earlier? Yeah. There's another one, Sandy, who says that I was 16 in 1969 as a young Bertie's patron, but I was in the younger side. She just loved the music scene. So there's lots of great reminiscences there, Melissa, aren't there? And Carol's also come back, just to clarify, the mini shows were held in the gear shop.
In the gear shop.
Real shopping experience, she says. So when we look at all of this and thinking about that glorious wedding photo, it's almost as if there are two completely different segments of the population, aren't there? Was there much of a sense of culture shock, disapproval, approval from those who were still more traditional dressers at this time?
Oh, there was very much this, as I guess I was keen to note, this is the kind of vanguard of fashion. I'm not saying this was all Melbourne fashion. It's very much the case that I mean, you get a little bit of a sense that there was disapproval just from what I was saying about the kinds of attacks, the Sharpies versus, insofar as they're mods, as I said, it's not, the term that's used lightly, but that sometimes had a kind of either a class-based or a kind of homophobic subtext to them. So you get a bit of a sense of the kind of attempt to enforce particular masculine norms just from stories like that. But also, as I mentioned at the start, that generation gap, the age, so that there are men of an older generation that wouldn't think of going into the city without wearing their hat and a suit and collars and ties. And then you have, so that, I think we've lost the sense of how kind of startling and the baby boomers sense of that kind of casual look, slouchy or casual look, wearing that into the city. I lost the sense of that being a really sort of edgy and hip, in a way that now we just kind of think, well, that's standard, but that very much wasn't at the time.
No, I mean, that's right. The women who still went into town to shop in their gloves, hat, coat, in the early 60s. Now, I don't know how much longer that persisted, but I guess for some time. And those, in parallel, perhaps.
Yes, I mean, a lot's made sort of in fashion history now about that moment where Jean Shrimpton comes to Derby Day in 1965 wearing the white shift dress. And a key part of the reason that that's kind of shocking is because of the rule, very particular rules that operate at the races. It's still obviously very different. This race fashion is different from everyday fashion. But, you have well before that, or at the same time, Judy Jacques, the jazz singer, or plenty of people wearing that kind of fashion. It's just that it's they're young people and they're not wearing them necessarily to the races, you know, but that kind of, insofar as it's a revolution in fashion, and been sort of happening before that as well.
And then gradually percolates, I guess. And I can still remember as a child, my father making the huge, what was for him, the huge transition from wearing a white shirt to work to wearing a colour shirt to work. And that was, and at that time, pale blue or pale yellow. So nothing psychedelic about it. But that was a huge shift for him. And it took many, many years before he would countenance that.
Yes, there's a fantastic history that I've read. I think it's Wayne Murdoch. I just apologise for forgetting his surname, which is about camp Melbourne subculture from the interwar period, 1930s in particular, 1920s, 1930s, and of people being sort of told that wearing a coloured shirt was, again, it's sort of, you know, of camp men being kind of upbraided for wearing coloured shirts. So they're very much, I mean, that's kind of office wear that we're talking about, though, and city wear.
Yes,
that idea about.
Yes, absolutely. Certainly not discotheque wear or even evening wear, but it is interesting in the sense that the casualisation, perhaps, of even office wear that follows. What, a decade later? Was it as long as that, or earlier than that? Yeah.
Do you mean from as long as 1930s or
no, from the 1960s? How long it takes to start to influence the rest of general dress.
Yeah, definitely by the real shifts that start happening in the early 70s, you know, where it becomes permissible. I know in the case of my own grandfather to wear kind of shorts and long socks with a short sleeve shirt to work.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I mentioned obviously Jim Colbert. I don't know whether he's here today. I really thank him. But as I said, Harley Parker's photographs, some of which appear kind of on, you know, quite a number of scattered around the Miles Ago site, which is about Melbourne music history, and also in a what I hope will be a published memoir of his, which is sort of that early 70s moment in music and fashion, were also really useful, but they're just, you know, that they're thinking about 70s fashion, we'll have to save for another day. So.
Yes, indeed. Melissa, that's probably a very nice note to finish, and to give you a bit of a rest, and just to say thank you so much. It was a fascinating lecture. It's obviously stimulated lots and lots of memories, some of which might feed into your research at some point, I guess. So thank you so much for sharing with us today, and thank you everybody for your own contributions, both questions and comments. That was terrific. Thanks you very much.
Thanks, Margaret, and thanks all. See you.